be able to introduce our speaker, our first speaker this morning, who's Professor Barbara Perry, who's the director at the Center on Hate, Bias and Extremism at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. She's also a professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at that university. Barbara Perry has published extensively on the subject of hate crime and is considered to be an expert from the sociological and criminological perspectives on hate crime. And more recently, she has also published work and an interesting monograph on right-wing extremism. So the subject of her lecture today connects directly with the subject of our conference, hate crime connected with freedom of speech, and this is done from a criminological approach. Barbara Perry will touch on a worrying symptom that is becoming quite common and condoned in certain extremist circles, but also risks expanding into the mainstream politics. And this is what she calls the normalization of hate crime. And that is the risk of making hate speech and bigotry acceptable, especially in the context of disinformation and conspiracy theories, of which we have seen some in Canada, quite a lot south of Canada, and we are seeing quite a lot of that as well in Europe. So we have the French elections coming this weekend. Hate is present in the electoral debates, in the speeches. We have seen the victory of Viktor Orban in Hungary, and this is to mention only two. I'm not going to mention all the extreme parties that have congratulated Orban on his victory, but this is certainly a worrying symptom, and in order to learn more about the subject, we are extremely pleased to be able to hear Dr. Perry. Please, Barbara, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. I can't see the screen for some reason. I've just got a blue screen in front of me. It's a little disorienting not being able to see. But thank you so much for the invitation. I really wish that I was able to join you all there in person, but times intervene. But very happy to at least be able to join you virtually. I think these are very important conversations that we're all engaged in here, given the context in which many of us are living. And I think the extent to which, COVID and the conspiracy theories around COVID, for example, have exacerbated many of the problems. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen now and assume that you all can see it. Hearing nothing to the contrary, I'll go ahead. Yeah. So I do come at this more from a criminological perspective. So the focus is not just on hate crime, but as you'll see, a number of dimensions of expressions of hate, not just in terms of criminal behavior, but other kinds of speech acts and expressions as well. I just want to contextualize the conversation, first of all, by referring to some of the very limited provisions we have around hate crime in the Canadian context. And I think that the first thing to note is, unlike our neighbors to the south, unlike the US, we actually do have or do recognize that there are limits on free speech, that hate speech is one of those areas that, as the Charter of Rights suggests, it can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So, for example, we've had a number of court decisions that have defined quite explicitly what constitutes hate and hate speech, and I frame it in terms of not just harmful speech or speech that's offensive, but really damaging speech that has often dire consequences for the communities to which it's aimed. And Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision, Warman v. Kuba, actually distilled those hallmarks of hate, as they described it, into 11 markers that can be used to really set aside hate and hate speech from free speech. And it included things like, vilification of particular communities, dehumanization of communities, suggesting that they have no redeemable characteristics, that they're wholly evil, and in fact, that call explicitly for violence. And some of that is captured in sections 318 and 319 in the criminal code. These are really what we call the propaganda offenses: advocating genocide, public incitement of hatred, and willful promotion of hatred. We have this other provision, mischief relating to religious property specifically, which is actually quite frequently invoked. And then we have the sentencing enhancement legislation, which means that at sentencing, that's when the hate element comes in, when we're talking about sort of standard crimes, assaults, arsons, those sorts of things. The bottom line is that none of these pieces of legislation are invoked very regularly. We have something like 40 cases under the 318 to 319 in the past dozen years or so. So really not very many successful prosecutions there. Sentencing enhancement provision, we don't even know. We don't track it. But the sense is that it's very rarely applied. The other bit of context I want to provide is just to think about the harms of hate, and whether we're talking about hate speech or whether we're talking about hate crime, the consequences are sort of cumulative, if you will, and expansive. So obviously there's harm to the initial victim, but we find with hate crime specifically, of course, the harm is greater than it is for parallel crimes that are not motivated by hate, in terms of the psychological impact, in terms of both the severity and the longevity of those psychological and mental impacts, the anxiety, the fear, for example. We also find that many of those same effects carry over to other members of the group. So this is where we get that notion of the message crime, right? That it's not just the initial victim or the immediate victim, but in fact the broader community that also feels those same effects, that also reads that narrative, reads that message that's sent, which implies that they're not valued, they're not welcome in the community. And that can be, very immediate in terms of, the local neighborhood or, the community in a particular city. But it can also extend to the other members of the group outside of the immediate area as well. And I think one of the clearest examples of that in the North American context was when Matthew Shepard was killed, young gay man. And that had really significant ripple effects for the LGBTQ plus community outside of Wyoming, the state where it happened, outside of the United States even, a much broader impact. We also see, and we're beginning to see this evidence that there's also harm to other targeted communities. So if there is, a sort of a well-publicized or particularly heinous attack against the Muslim community, for example, we often find other faith communities, marginalized communities in particular, or frequently targeted communities, also fear that they'll be next, right? If it's this religious community or this racialized community today, it could be our community tomorrow. So that's an interesting piece that we're just starting to unpack. And the last one, I think, is something that I've been looking at increasingly in recent years, not just the harm to the targeted communities or similar communities, but the harms to the broader social norms and values, the extent to which it highlights the fissures or perhaps creates fissures within society, or chasms or distance between communities. So again, something that we're just starting to grapple with from a research perspective. So in the Canadian context, there are three areas I think that have really come to the fore in the last half dozen years, 8 years or so, that have really, I think, brought to the surface our concerns around hate and its many manifestations. So I'm going to lead you through some of what we know about hate crime, about online hate, and about right-wing extremism in the Canadian context. So starting with hate crime, we've seen some really dramatic data, official data in the past few years. So if you look at this figure here, you'll see, and we've really only been publishing reports on hate crime for a very short period of time. But in the first few years, 2009 to 2016, it's relatively stable. There's not a lot of fluctuation. These are not great differences year over year. And then we come to 2016, 2017, you see a dramatic 47% increase in police reported hate crime. That is the official measure of hate crime in the Canadian context. And again, sort of think about we'll come back to talk about this sort of context later on. But this is sort of the first year of the Trump administration, right? Where we see, just as the US saw, this dramatic leap in reported hate crimes, 47%. Bit of a decline the next year, up again a bit in 2019. And then 2020, the less data. So this report just came out a little while ago, just a month or so ago. A further 37% increase, bringing hate crime in Canada up to its historic high point. And again, so many factors playing into this increase: COVID and the response to conspiracy theories, the response to scapegoating in that particular context. So really worrying trends that we're seeing here. And I think this really highlights that. So what this shows is in yellow here, these are the increases. These are the numbers of hate crimes over 2020. And you can see in virtually every month except for March and April, it was an increase over the previous year. That's at a time, if you look in blue, that's at a time when rates of crime generally were decreasing rather than increasing. So dramatic increases in hate crime at the same time that we're seeing slight decreases in crime and specifically violent crime overall. So again, highlights the disparity there, I think. Just in terms of what that looks like, the distribution of types of crime. Of course, the most common was general mischief. So typically property crimes, graffiti, vandalism, that sort of thing, but also mischief in relation to religious property, uttering threats, common assault. So not just mischief, but other more serious crimes as well. I think it's also important to not dismiss general mischief as insignificant, right? These lower level crimes, if you will, because they're so common. And again, dramatically underreported. We think maybe 20-25% of all incidents are reported. But general mischief, these sorts of incidents, again, if you think about vandalism, if you think about graffiti, right, the swastika painted on the billboard or the sign or the overpass, the issue with them is, again, in terms of that community impact, that message that is sent, because these are very visible, very public crimes. So the message is carried out, the message is visible to all passersby, right? Anyone who is exposed to it, as opposed to, crimes of interpersonal violence, for example, that do target an individual. So really important, I think, to keep in mind what the consequences are and what the implications are for that category of very visible crimes. In terms of the distribution, we see here, again, the patterns year over year are consistent in that crimes targeting race and ethnicity, followed by religion, followed by sexual orientation, are the most frequent. Again, in 2020, the most recent data, that dramatic increase was in large part attributable to increases in hate crime targeting racialized communities, in particular Asian communities and the Black community in Canada, and to some extent Indigenous community as well. And again, we'll come back to talk about the context and what accounts for that in part. So one of the things I mentioned earlier was this dramatic under recording. So as alarming as those data are in the Canadian context, I think it's important to put it in perspective. So in 2019, for example, the General Social Survey, which is a national survey conducted every 5 or 6 years, found that, so there was just a handful of questions. I think there are 3 or 4 questions in the General Social Survey about hate crime specifically. So people are asked if they've been a target of a very discrete set of crimes, so a very narrow set of crimes, and if they had been, whether they thought it was motivated by hate or bias, and what that identity, that targeted identity was. So we see that in that year there were 223,000 hate crimes reported to the General Social Survey, yet only 22% of those were actually reported to police. Still, 48,000 were reported to police, and yet, and this is quite typical, we see under 2,000 reported by police in general. I mean, that's the trend, but in that particular year, just under 2,000. So 46,000 incidents unaccounted for after they'd been reported to police. And you see on the other side here, this funnel. So this was actually over a 5-year period. We see just over 8,500 police reported hate crimes. So that's not all the hate crimes that occurred, obviously, but only those, that very small proportion that was reported to police. And you see the attrition throughout as it moves through the system. In less than 20% of the cases were charges laid, and by the time we get down here to going to court, and sort of any consequences for those crimes, very small proportion. So the hate motivation, the hate crimes themselves are being lost as we move through the justice system, which is a serious issue in terms of lack of enforcement. If we think about the prosecutions that I mentioned earlier on around the propaganda offenses, and then you add in the hate incidents, the hate crimes not being sort of recorded or responded to by law enforcement, raises really serious concerns about the extent to which law enforcement are capable, able, willing to intervene in these sorts of incidents. One of the things that often isn't captured necessarily in the hate crime data is online hate. I think there's a lot of uncertainty amongst targets or observers of online hate about sort of where they stand in terms of legality, where it crosses the line. So online hate is actually rarely reported, but frequently experienced, as we'll see. And just sort of harking back to where we started with that conversation of the harms of hate generally, I want to think about the specific harms of online hate. And some of it parallels the more general kinds of consequences, but some of it is unique to this particular environment. So obviously there's the harm done to its targets, whether they are targeted directly or whether they're observing hateful speech in a more sort of in a broader climate, not necessarily targeted towards them specifically, but the denigration of their community or a community. There's also the risk, and this is one of the things that distinguishes online hate, the potential for it to radicalize or to mobilize others. So that's where we get that idea of incitement to hatred. So that's one of the spaces that online is one of the spaces where we're very likely to see that form of incitement or the contribution to creating hostility, creating fear of particular communities as well, so that people might become, as we suggest here, sympathetic or in fact actively engaged in those narratives and in other forms and expressions of hate as well. We also have to think, of course, of the effect that it has on the culture and the feelings of safety and inclusion within those online spaces. So we hear of people, sort of leaving particular platforms or leaving particular groups because of, excuse me, because of the exposure that they've had to hate directed towards them or even towards others as well. So, it can have a chilling impact, obviously, in that context. And then, of course, the effect that online hate has on public discourse and on polarization, right? This creation of echo chambers that reinforce, some of the conspiracy theories, some of the disinformation, some of the hateful narratives that are so prevalent online. So Canadians are very active, I think, as most folks are in this contemporary space. Canadians very active online. So in 2018, over 90% of Canadians were active online. And you can see here, 78% sent messages using instant messaging, 52% made online voice calls, 75% use social networking websites or apps. And this is what we're using social media for. A lot of it is sort of just keeping up to date with what our community might be engaged in, our networks are engaged in, friends, family, and others. It's here in particular, right, when sharing thoughts, pictures, of videos with friends and family, sharing thoughts, pictures, or videos publicly, where we start to run into issues around hate. Around online hate. That is the distribution of memes and videos and pictures that are, sort of informed by disinformation, that are themselves vilifying narratives of particular communities. So this is where we see in multiple forms, right? In images, and often in music. If we think about, sharing music videos, that sort of thing, there's some horrifically misogynistic, racist, anti-Semitic music videos and other kinds of videos as well, readily available online. So, a whole array of opportunities for sharing hate, and in many forms, right? So here's sort of an idea of what, the spaces of hate. So, of course, we have some direct attacks. That is emailed messages in particular, or other kinds of directed messages to individuals, groups, communities. Community-based organizations are often targets of this sort of thing. One of the things that we've really begun to pay attention to, I think in many contexts, not just in the Canadian context, but is the extent to which women and people of color who are running for office or who are in office are particularly prone to attacks, hate mail, if you will, in their inbox. Threats of violence, physical violence, sexual violence directed towards them, because they're seen as, being outside of their allowable boundaries, as becoming too empowered as part of the political process. So we see those very direct attacks, and then we see those more indirect attacks. So these are the spaces in which we see those very derogatory or denigrating narratives, the images, the memes, the tropes, the videos, all of those pieces that couch particular communities in very negative ways. I think we're all sadly familiar with those. And then, of course, we have the dedicated spaces. The dedicated spaces of hate, dedicated websites that are associated, or other platforms that are associated with hateful individuals and hate groups as well. And of course, we've seen those on mainstream, on Facebook. Some hate groups with Facebook pages, with Twitter accounts, all of that sort of thing, slowly, however, being edged out of the mainstream into some of the fringe platforms that are being created as free speech spaces where there are no filters, there is no moderation of speech, and so they're allowed to, or in fact enabled to express those very damaging narratives without intervention, without fear. And so we're seeing more and more, Telegram, Gab, those sorts of fringe networks, where they're creating these social networks, these echo chambers amongst themselves, both publicly, but also in the dark web and encrypted sites that are much more difficult to monitor and to engage. We still see even on YouTube, right, some horrific music and music videos, white power music. We just finished a study a year or so ago looking explicitly at YouTube white power videos, and just, I mean, the array of genres that are represented there was really quite dramatic. I think we tend to think of metal music, heavy metal music, as being white power music, but country and western hate music is as popular as the metal music. There's folk music, which is really kind of odd when you think about, I think we tend to think of folk music often as, protest songs and those sorts of things, but also represented there. Gaming platforms are one of the areas that are of increasing concern, and I think that there are a lot of scholars as well as law enforcement intelligence communities that are looking very closely at the role that gaming platforms play in grooming people, in bringing them into the movement. And then sometimes it's the games themselves. I mean, there's some horrifically racist games out there that are, in fact, promoted by far-right groups, but it's really the ancillaries, the chat rooms that are associated with the games that become problematic. So, folks become lured into deeper and deeper and darker spaces from those chat rooms. So, it's a lengthy process. It's a non-linear process. There's a lot of stops and starts there, but it is a very effective mechanism, primarily for youth, right? Drawing youth into the movement, but adults as well, right? There are a lot of adult gamers as well that maybe are as unable to recognize the signs of grooming, the signs of mobilization as our youth. Of course, we see the online memes that are shorthand and, sort of argot within particular movements that, unfortunately, many of them sort of gravitate into the mainstream as well. And then we have to think about the algorithms, the extent to which algorithms and search chains also lead people into darker and darker spaces as they land on one particular music video or a series of music videos that have, racist themes or misogynistic themes. And then what do the recommendations look like? Often more of the same. So in terms of exposure, so just a reminder here of how extensive online use is for all of us. Again, not just Canadians. This is a universal phenomenon. But in terms of the exposure, 60% of Canadians overall report sightings of online hate. And 80% of Canadian youth report seeing online hate. And so this was 2019, I think, 2018 or 2019. So I suspect that the numbers at the end of 2020, 2021, in the midst of COVID, are actually even higher than that. Where do we see it? Again, it continues to be on the mainstream platforms, not just the fringe platforms, but we continue to see this sort of activity on mainstream platforms as well. This comes out of, so the next little couple of slides really come from the work that we've been doing with ISD, Institute for Strategic Dialogue in the UK, and our updated study of sort of the environmental scan of right-wing extremism in Canada. And so these are the observations that we had in looking at I think 5 different platforms, 6 different platforms, social media platforms, in terms of the activities of the far right groups in the Canadian context specifically. So fairly active there. So I think especially active on Twitter, obviously 38,000, almost 39,000 tweets, many extremist in nature, engaged on 4chan and Telegram. Again, a couple of the fringe platforms. A reach of over 1 million users, if you will, retweets, comments, likes, that sort of thing, and some evidence of, explicitly racist and hostile language as well. Again, just in terms of the distribution, no surprise there. The vast majority, and again, thinking this is 2020, vast majority of conversation was around COVID, and much of that involved misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic and anti-Asian conspiracy theories in particular. But we also see an interesting distribution here in terms of, messaging around the U.S. politics. So again, the Trump effect there, and Canadian politics as well. So in particular, we see a lot of anti-Trudeau rhetoric online there. And then we see comments around, other issues like BLM, Black Lives Matter protests, climate, crime, migration, and the economy. But again, the bulk devoted to COVID and its implications. I should say, so, I talked about the conspiracy theories around Jewish community and Asian communities, but also a lot of this was revolving around anti-mandate, anti-vax, and anti-science narratives as well. If we look at the communities that were targeted by the far right sites, we see that by far, especially on 4chan, the Black community was most likely to be the topic of conversation, the target of hate speech, as well as LGBTQ2+ communities, which is really interesting. It's something that we've seen, and you're probably seeing it in Europe as well, but we've certainly been seeing in North America this resurgence in homophobia and transphobia within the far right. But no community is safe from the ire of the far right in particular. So I'm going to move now to talk more explicitly and concretely about the far right in Canada, because we've seen some dramatic changes and shifts, and we've sort of begun to catch up to European trends that we've been seeing for some time. Canadians were quite slow to come to the party, but they've come full force in recent years. So when we published our first study of the far right in 2015, the focus was really on, very traditional elements of the far right: skinheads, Nazis, white supremacists. What we're seeing is a diffusion and almost areas of specialization within the far right movement in Canada, other countries as well, but certainly in the Canadian context, so that we have, explicitly anti-Muslim pillars now that have separated out from, the broader narratives around racial superiority and religious superiority, if you will. Obviously, the accelerationists, the base, Atomwaffen, and now Diagolon in the Canadian context. The alt-right, on the heels of the first Trump election, has become quite a dominant force. And we do also include an explicit recognition of the manosphere, or the explicitly misogynistic arm of the far right movement. So some overlap there with the incel movement. And then the patriots and militia, sort of one of the, excuse me, one of the more aggressive components of the movement. Sorry, excuse me. And if we have time in question and answer, perhaps I can define these a little more concretely. The other piece is that, and you see, I've got these conspiracy theorists and anti-authority movement, very much a part of the far right, but I've sort of put them in italics because in both of these cases, the conspiracy theorists and the anti-authority adherents span the political spectrum from left to right, but there are very explicitly far right elements of both, so we sort of captured them here. Important to recognize lone actors, and it's almost a misnomer to call them lone actors. These are still people who are very much engaged with the narratives, the online narratives, especially the online narratives associated with the far right. But their crimes, their violence is acted out solo, right? It's not a group. It's not necessarily part of a conspiracy, but an individual acting on those narratives that they've been consuming online. And this is where we've seen the most dramatic incidents of violence in the Canadian context in particular. So it's a very different movement, a much more expansive movement and inclusive, if I can use that term, movement in the Canadian context than it was even 5 or 6 years ago. If we look at sort of the risk associated with the movement, and this is from the first study, we're just sort of collating and tabulating final numbers for the current study. But between 1980 and 2014, 2015, we identified over 120 incidents of violence associated with the far right in the Canadian context, which for, relative to some countries doesn't seem like much, but in the Canadian context, to put it in perspective, during that same period of time, we identified about 8 incidents of Islamist-inspired extremism. And what's interesting, of course, is that law enforcement and intelligence emphasis and priority has been placed on Islamist-inspired violence rather than what might be called homegrown violence. So I think, if there's anything that has come out of the past few years, it is a recognition, increased recognition since 2015 within the law enforcement community that we also need to turn our attention here. Just looking at, I mentioned the lone actors. And they have been responsible in the Canadian context for what is now 24 murders. This totals 23. We need to add another one here, and I'll mention that in a moment. So since 2014, in 2014, this was a young man very much inspired by far-right anti-authority ideologies that killed 3 RCMP officers. 2017, 6 Muslim men at prayer were killed in a mosque just outside of Quebec City in Saint-Foy. 2018, and this was an individual motivated obviously by Islamophobia, very much a fan of Trump, and it was on the same weekend as Trump announced the banning of banning entry for those coming from Muslim majority communities. So no coincidence, no accident there, I think, in terms of timing. 2018, this was, you may have heard about the murders in downtown Toronto, where 10 people were killed by a young man motivated by incel ideologies when he ran them down with a rented van. And then most recently in London, Ontario, 4 members of a Muslim family were murdered, again, by a young man motivated by anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant sentiments, running them over with his pickup truck. So 10 people in the 2018 case, 10 people were killed immediately. One additional one just about 2 months ago, I believe it was, succumbed to their injuries. They'd been hospitalized since 2018 and did die from those injuries. So that's actually 11 attributable to that murderer. So very dramatic consequences, very dramatic evidence, I think, of the risk associated with the far right. Other trends that we're seeing here, we talked about, sort of the numbers of incidents. We've seen a dramatic growth in the numbers of people drawn to the movement. So we're seeing more active groups So at the end of that first study, we identified just over 100 active groups. In the past couple of years, we've identified more than 300 active groups. But what is more important and significant is that what law enforcement has described as sort of an atomization of the movement, that is more and more individuals being drawn to far-right narratives and communities without necessarily affiliating with a particular group. So they're sort of cherry picking narratives and strategies and tactics from a number of different venues, sort of creating their own worldview, their own way of approaching, their Islamophobia or their anti-immigrant sentiment or their anti-Asian sentiment, whatever the case might be. Virtually impossible to count the numbers of individuals, but the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, for example, is putting the numbers, estimating the numbers at well over 1 million in the Canadian context. We're also seeing quite a considerable demographic shift in the movement, so that it's older, it's more educated, and often well employed. And we're seeing some of that coming out of the Freedom Convoy, so-called Freedom Convoys, the Ottawa occupation earlier this year. We certainly saw that in the U.S. context in January 6, where this was not just a youth movement. This was middle-aged and older individuals, professionals of all sorts, including law enforcement and military personnel, doctors, lawyers, accountants. Professionals who, were still well employed, coming to the movement, often, sort of coming in through conspiracy theories, these widely disseminated conspiracy theories, and then again, being lured in deeper and deeper into the movement. We're seeing incredible coalition building. The convoys, again, were an incredible example of that, of very disparate elements of the movement coming together in Ottawa, at the border crossings across the country, which is something very new. I mean, the first study we found there was incredible infighting within groups and across groups as well, and jockeying for position and power and place and voice. We're seeing more collective strategizing across communities now, often online again. And arms and training. So this is one of the most worrying things, especially with the accelerationist movements and the patriot movements, who are often recruiting from law enforcement and military communities. So these folks are armed, they're trained to use those arms, they're trained in tactical strategies, and then you add in their hateful narratives, and I think that's a really dangerous combination. What are the contexts for hate that we're seeing? I think it's important to put all of these patterns that we've been seeing in the Canadian context. I mean, hate like we've never seen it for us, and I think it's sort of layers and layers and layers of contributing factors here, almost an imperfect storm, if you will. Of course, we've had the effect of Trump and his narratives, not just narratives but policies as well, right? Restrictions on particular communities in terms of immigration, in terms of military service, all of those sorts of pieces. His explicit vilification of particular communities, which has emboldened and enabled not just the American far-right movement and the American sort of anti-immigrant or anti-Muslim or anti-gay narrative, but also has affected us, right? Those social media borders are porous. So we've also been affected by, his Twitter feeds and his rants, not just in his first election and administration, but obviously also around the second election and the stolen election from his perspective. And there's a very strong pro-Trump contingent within the far right in the Canadian context. A few years back we had, and this was sort of in two parts, right? We had the Syrian refugee crisis, and I'll come back to why I've got it in quotation marks there. But then we had also a number of refugees leaving the U.S. after Trump was elected because of fear that they would be deported, they would be forced to leave the US. And I have it in quotations here. Yes, obviously, I mean, it was a crisis for the refugees in terms of the Syrian refugees in particular, in terms of the threat to them. But in the Canadian context, you know, we were very able to absorb the numbers that were coming. So, but it was constructed by the far right as a crisis, as a real threat to our values and the threat to, you know, white supremacy and you know, sort of white dominance as well. So that became a rallying point, a rallying call. Remember earlier on, I mentioned in 2020, we saw a dramatic increase in anti-Black and anti-Indigenous violence, and that is sort of backlash against the increased activism of BLM movement, but also Indigenous resistance in the Canadian context, blockades, land defenders, especially in Western Canada. Obviously, COVID has played a significant role there, again, in terms of reinvigorating anti-Semitism, in terms of you know, bringing to the fore anti-Asian hostilities and scapegoating in that context. It's brought to the fore anti-statism, anti-authority elements, and again, that was very much at the heart of the convoys in the Canadian context. The U.S. insurrection, the events of January 6th, have also played a significant role in the Canadian movement as well, in the sense that it was in part inspiration, but also it was something that was celebrated by the Canadian far right. They saw that as, especially the accelerationists, right, as the beginning of the Civil War in the U.S. that would perhaps have consequences for Canada as well. So that they were, you know, they were back and forth with their Canadians were back and forth with their American counterparts leading up to January 6th and on January 6th, saying, you know, if we can make it across the border, we'll come and join you. We'll stand shoulder to shoulder and support you. If we can't make it, know that we're still in your corner. And in fact, we saw sympathy rallies and protests in Canada on January 6th as well. And so when the convoys, the Freedom Convoy, was rolling across Canada, we actually heard people saying, this is our January 6th. This is the beginning of our Civil War. So the convoys, again, were a flashpoint, really brought together very disparate elements of the far right with more populist concerns in a way that we had not previously seen in the Canadian context. So it remains to be seen what the long-term consequences are of that. We're still seeing, you know, small convoy protests or slow rolls, as they're calling them, in many Canadian cities across the country. So, you know, while they're out of Ottawa and while they're gone from the border points, they're still, many of them are still very active. The other thing, and this is, you know, sort of what the references made earlier on to this notion of the normalization of hate, and it's sort of a trickle down effect in terms of, you know, political narratives that lend weight, that lend credibility to the kinds of narratives that we've been talking about here. So, you know, we like to lay the blame at the feet of Donald Trump for all of those reasons I mentioned earlier, but we have also seen, predating Trump and after Trump, political discourse that has been very similar here. So the last conservative prime minister, Stephen Harper, you know, made very public statements, anti-Semitic statements, anti-immigrant statements, the likes of which we'd probably not heard from a federal leader previously. So he talked about the niqab being offensive. He talked about Islamization in Canada being the greatest threat. At the same time, Kelly Leitch, a member of the Conservative Party, promoted this notion of screening for Canadian values. She promoted the notion of a hotline, a call-in hotline around barbaric cultural practices, as she called it. I think that, you know, very thinly veiled reference to, or very thinly veiled form of Islamophobia, if you will. Legault, who is the current premier of Quebec, the province of Quebec, on the eve of the anniversary of the murders of Muslim men that I mentioned previously, said, I don't think there's Islamophobia in Quebec, so I don't see why there would be a day dedicated to Islamophobia. So in the face of not just those murders, but a whole array of indicators of really intense and extensive Islamophobia, still felt able to make that kind of statement. It's not just racialized communities that are targeted. Derek Sloan was a member of the Conservative Party. He's been ejected finally from the Conservative caucus when the bill to ban conversion therapy for LGBT communities was introduced, claimed that banning conversion would legalize child abuse. So playing into stereotypes and imagery of pedophilia within the LGBTQ community. And then most recently, the interim leader of the Conservative Party here, speaking about the convoy, the Freedom Convoys, puppeting what Trump said in the context of Charlottesville and the Unite the Right rally. There are good people on both sides, drawing explicitly from the same line uttered by Trump then. And this image that I have here, excuse me, this is the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, and this is Faith Goldie, who at the time, no pun intended, was the golden child of the far right, and so he is posing here with someone who was widely known, widely recognized, and some of her minions, if you will, as a very active and vocal adherent to a far right movement. She was at the time running for mayor of Toronto, arguably the most multicultural city in Canada. And in fact, she garnered 20,000 votes. During that same election, there were about 40,000 votes given to folks running on explicitly far right agendas, far right platforms. And we see that, again, that trickle down effect. We've seen it in the hate crime data. We've seen it in the growth of the far right, but we've also seen it in public opinion polling in recent years, where we're seeing that recognition by community members that it is, in fact, more acceptable to express negative sentiments about other views. It is more acceptable to express a prejudice against, in this case, Muslims and Jewish communities in particular. One of the most concerning pieces of data, I think, here is that 37% indicated they felt immigration was a threat to white Canadians. So, borrowing directly from the playbook of far-right narratives. So it has, impacted public opinion. These are quite dramatic shifts for us in the Canadian context. So how do we intervene? And I won't go through all of these one by one, but I think, the key is, the need for political leadership, the need for an acknowledgement, a recognition, and a response to these dramatic increases, this dramatic spread and expansion of hate in its many forms. And so we're beginning to see more and more conversations in this area. We have, we will soon have, it seems, hopefully, a national action plan, not just on racism and discrimination, but on hate specifically. So I'll be sitting in on a roundtable that will begin to form the foundation for that in a couple of weeks. I think one of the things that I've mentioned a couple of times is the extent to which we don't enforce the legislation that we already have. So before we start thinking about new legislation, I think we really need to think about enhancing the capacity and the political will for law enforcement, for the Crown, for the courts to take seriously the hate and its impacts in terms of charging and in terms of disposition of those cases as well. But of course, we do need to strengthen our legislation around online hate in particular, which is more and more challenging, obviously, because of jurisdictional issues. One One of the things that we tend to focus on in our work at the center and in our scholarship is the need for multi-sectoral partnerships. I focused on legislation and enforcement of that legislation, but these are not just criminal justice issues. These are not just legal issues. These are social issues. These are issues around education. So we do need the work and the contributions from multiple sectors of government, all levels of government, federal, provincial, municipal, but also from within each of those, right? Education, public health, even social services, right? To excuse me, to support those who are, because of their current conditions, perhaps, are more vulnerable to these sorts of narratives. But we also need, and I think this is part of the National Action Plan, we need to support the work of civil society organizations who are often developing really innovative and valuable programming around countering hate in its many forms, around supporting the targets and the victims of hate, helping them to build resiliency. So I think that that's really important, that that kind of work is supported. And I think that this last one, again, is something that I harp on whenever I have the opportunity, and that is just this very notion of, in the online space in particular, enhancing our critical digital literacy. We don't look very closely, we don't think very deeply or reflectively about what passes on our screens, on our devices. And I think that we need to have those conversations, develop that kind of resilience, not just for youth, but for adults as well. Again, think about the shift in the demographics that I spoke about earlier on, that more and more adults are being drawn to the movement, more and more adults are being influenced by, conspiracy theories, disinformation, and, is there a way to engage them? That's a much more difficult and challenging audience, I think, to engage than youth even, right? We're adults, we're set in our ways. It's very difficult to change. So we have to develop, I think, really creative strategies, maybe working with, with the obviously with the public sector, but also with the labor movement in terms of enhancing this capacity for adults specifically. So bottom line, plenty of work to be done. I think we do need that political leadership to call it out, call hate when hate when they see it, but also provide the tools, the infrastructure that is needed to overcome the problems that I've presented to you here today. So I will leave it at that, and thank you for your time and your attention, and looking very much forward to a conversation here, questions and answers. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara. That was most interesting presentation full of data and statistics and trends. I think while we gather questions from the audience, I might perhaps kick off, and I have a few questions. Some of them are very specific and punctual. One of them is out of my confessed ignorance. You mentioned as one of the constellations of right-wing extremism, the accelerationists, and I couldn't figure what those are. Maybe you can illustrate what are accelerationists? Is it people who like to drive very fast, or?
That too. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is what it says on the tin, right? So accelerationists. So these are the folks like the base, like Adam Waffen division, whose intent is to provoke, to accelerate what they think is an imminent civil war. And often there's no idea of what their goal is at the other end, what the end game is, but it really is about disruption. about fomenting polarization, fomenting dissent, and division. And so it might be a very traditional, if we think about, for sort of the far or white supremacist movement, it might be this very traditional Rahowa or racial holy war. But for others, it might just be sort of an all-out civil war, not just race-based or not grounded in religious difference, but just the idea that the current system is corrupt, the current system is broken, which it is in some respects, but I mean, they come at it from a very different direction. And the idea is to disrupt the current system.
They have nothing to do with climate change then? That's at the fringes of some of the elements of the movement. But again, it revolves around a rejection of the science of climate change. Right. That it is, it's part of the mythology of the liberal elite. Okay, thank you. As we collect questions, maybe I can ask another one. Amongst the flashpoints that you were mentioning concerning right-wing extremism, I couldn't see one on something that has become quite common in Europe, which is what the right-wing call this, they call it gender ideology, and they pick very much on gender ideology as a target of attack. I don't know if there is any commonality there.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we're seeing more and more of that within the far right, and especially those. Again, this is something novel to us, sort of the extent to which religious narratives are also coming into the far right. I mean, the Canadian far right is not like the American far right. It tended to be much more secular than their American counterparts. But we're seeing that come in, and that is also then influencing the conversations around gender identity, around the gender roles even. So that's sort of that misogynistic element, which also are often homophobic and transphobic. And I think that they really were given incredible support and credibility by Jordan Peterson, who many of you are probably familiar with, and his rejection of the validity of gender pronouns, people's chosen gender pronouns. So we are starting to see that come to the fore in the Canadian context to some extent.
Thank you. And another question before I turn to the actual questions of the audience. I have collected some already. Is there any divide concerning the multinational nature of Canada? Is there a difference in the forms of right-wing extremism in the Quebec and Francophone communities as regards the Anglophone one? And what is the language that is mostly used for hate speech online, for instance? Have you detected any balance, or is there a clear imbalance in favor of English or otherwise?
That's such a great question. Yeah, I mean, most of it is in English, but there is a very distinct far-right movement in the Quebec context. There's the reproduction of some of the broader national movements, but there are elements. So the identitarian movement is much stronger, has been much stronger in Quebec than elsewhere. So the Quebec movement tends to be much more influenced, not by their American counterparts, and not by their Canadian counterparts so much as their French counterparts in Europe. So there is a much stronger emphasis there on, as there always is in the Quebec context, right? A distinct culture, Quebecois culture, a very distinct French and Catholic culture, and so that's the identity that they rally around. Not so much, sort of the Euro-Canadian, pan-European kind of identity, but something that is very distinct to Quebec. And so that's why we see Islamophobia in particular so much, such an important flashpoint for the narratives there, at the political level, but also within the movement.
Thank you. Now, questions from the audience. Which are the factors behind the increase of right-wing groups, right-wing extremism? what are the triggers of right-wing extremism? I think you mentioned some of them, but can you sort of theorize factors behind it?
Yeah, it's those flashpoints that I was referring to. I mean, there are so many pieces that play into it. And I think if we use the convoy, the Freedom Convoys as an example, that was a movement led by folks with and organized by folks with a long history and long trajectory of involvement in the far right. And they were able to exploit very popular concerns about mandates, COVID-related mandates, but also sort of the broader consequences of that. So the concerns about job loss, about loss of small businesses that close that may never reopen. Excuse me, in the hospitality industry, for example. In the context of Western Ontario, they were able to exploit concerns, this long history of Western alienation, the sense that they're not part of the country, that they don't benefit from, the distribution of the goodies from the federal government. So I think in COVID has provided an opportunity for the far right, and they're very good, the far right, at exploiting those kinds of populist concerns. The increasing anti-establishment sentiment that people are expressing. So they're able to tie that all up with a tidy bow.
Right. I have another specific question from the audience. You mentioned this underreporting and under-recording, and the question it concerns police officers. Is there any discussion in Canada about whether police officers should also be protected by hate crime legislation? And what do you think about this? What's your opinion?
Yeah, occasionally we hear that. In fact, someone he was a former officer himself, reached out to me a while ago, and he was, thinking about bringing something like this forward to an MP to present as a private member's bill to include police officers as a protected category. And so we do hear about that now and again. It's not a very large or loud contingent that's pushing for that. I think it's problematic if we think about the intention of hate crime, which is really to protect folks who are disempowered, and that certainly doesn't describe law enforcement by any stretch. And I think the whole idea of protecting occupations as opposed to sort of identities, cultural identities as we think of them, is problematic. And we see, in the U.S. we actually do see that, where just occupation in some states is a protected category.
Mm-hmm. Good. Amongst the solutions, or one of the possible suggestions on tackling and challenging hate, you mentioned enforcing already existing legislation. But in your paper, which I had the opportunity to read, you also mentioned that there is perhaps a risk sometimes of punitive approaches, that sometimes punitive approaches and sanctioning can have counter effects. How do we enforce already existing legislation, criminal legislation, and at the same time make sure that it doesn't backside?
Mm-hmm. Well, enforcing the legislation doesn't necessarily then mean that there are going to be purely punitive responses. I think that often we think that's the only option when someone is convicted, that they go to jail, right? Or they're issued a fine, something that is horrifically punitive. In some cases, that's warranted, right? In the most extreme sorts of cases, or the most intransigent. So we've had a case here, your Ward News, which was under some of the hate crime, the hate propaganda legislation. There were convictions there. But this had been something that had been ongoing for years. It was horrifically violent and vilifying language around women, around Jewish community, around racialized communities, you name it, they took aim. And so there, initially I think it was a suspended sentence. One of them is in jail because of a violation of conditions. But I think what is often more effective is not locking someone up, because there's no programming in the prisons that's going to, sort of change their minds, but different kinds of interventions. And this is where we've also failed in terms of developing programs for diversion, or programs for community sentencing that tackle these issues head on with the perpetrator. So I think that's where we have to be more creative. There was a Paul Agansky in the UK did sort of an accounting of programming around anti-hate programming for offenders. And it was, I think, 6 nations, 7 nations, and found a bare handful of such approaches. So I think that's where we need to think more creatively.
So in relation to this, we have another question. We have 2 more questions from the audience, and perhaps we can have a final comment. But one, in relation to this point, one of the questions is whether there are any experiences of restorative justice to tackle hate crime. So this has a lot to do with what you've been saying, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in very isolated cases, again, we're not having national conversations about that. However, having said that, we're actually on a funded project right now looking at the life cycle of a hate crime, borrowing from the work of some of our colleagues in the UK and Ireland and Europe, a study that they did a few years ago looking at 5 or 6 nations. But one of the pieces of that is we have a postdoc looking at exactly that, looking at some cases in which RJ has been used in hate crime incidents to see what impact it's had. What is the level of satisfaction on the part of all actors involved. So hopefully, well, assuming we find some satisfaction with that and some positive outcomes, perhaps this will start a dialogue about broader applications of RJ processes in the context of hate crime.
Good. So here is a final question from the audience, and I think this is going to lead to also one of the comments that I would like to finalize with before giving you the final words. So these expressions from politicians on controversial issues like the niqab or the veil, are they normalizing hate, or are they opening a public debate on these controversial issues? So do you think it's possible to distinguish those effects? And this question would then tie to a general comment, because you were mentioning that one of the harms that is provoked by hate speech is actually harms on the values and norms and the culture. And one of the specific harms of online hate speech is on its effect on public discourse and its polarizing potential. So this is a real question about what is the identity of our open democracies. How open and to what extent is there a risk by opening so much of actually normalizing hate speech?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is about context and the trajectory of a narrative. We have heard similar statements taken out of context, but really are meant to, as you suggest, open up a dialogue in the context that these kinds of statements have been used. I'll take the example of Derek Sloan, for example, talking about conversion therapy. He has a long trajectory of, very explicitly homophobic, transphobic speech, of, various forms of, racial vilification as well. So that is clearly not intended to open debate. It's intended to actually close debate in some respects, and to chill, right, and to silence those communities that are already marginalized. So, the kinds of comments I've taken here are typically part of a broader agenda or part of a broader and longer narrative associated with the speakers.
Well, yes, I think, do we have a final question? John Landa would like to ask a question. Micro, Mrs. John Landa, who is the director of the Human Rights Chair and the organizer of the conference with a team from the chair, would like to say a few words. So, John.
So do you hear me?
Can you hear him? Good.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I would like first of all to thank you for your inspiring conference, underlying the question that, so we are about to present our own report of incidents here in the Basque Country. So we've been collecting data in the Basque Country about hate incidents for only 1 decade. And the difference between the data you have available and the data we have when we have to report is huge. I mean, so it's impressive how you could be having information not only produced by the police, but also you have the information that's collected by judiciary, prosecutions, so you have the opportunity to track whether the public is reporting, what's the difference between the public reporting and the police reporting, and all the circle until a sentence has been handed down. At the same time, you have a lot of data available about perpetrators, and that's a way, it's a good basis for trying to inspire afterwards public policies. That's something we are lacking. At the same time, we are on the way. So it's been very inspiring because here in the audience, perhaps you could not see it, but there are politicians, there are members of the Basque unit of hate crimes, there are so human rights activists, there is a representative of the People's Defender of the Basque Country. So, I mean, so it's a good mirror, and beyond the Basque Country also, because the size of Canada, what it comes in terms of how many reports has been collected, and the population also, although we are very different in cultural terms, it could be a mirror to try to progress in this direction. I would like not to abuse of the word, but I would like to put 2 questions, perhaps, if you could answer them. You've been affirming that there have been 48,000 reported incidents by the public in comparison to 2,000 that have been reported by the police. Has it been the origin of any kind of public discussion about it? Because it seems to me as though it could be a kind of subtle accusation of that there is something wrong, that the people are reporting and the police officers are not taking them into account. And the second question, perhaps connected, so the difference between what's inside the circle when the police officers have reported and the final outcome, only 3% have been sentenced, handed down. Whether that's something that triggers also public attention, and I'm finishing the question, to which extent, therefore, is there very high in the agenda, this kind of issues? So to which extent hate crime is a public concern, is something that is subject to discussion or is something that should be put on the agenda by lobbyists because they don't take care? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, where to start there? Yeah, so I think 2 pieces in terms of what's happening at the level of law enforcement with respect to the under-recording. Never mind the under-reporting, but the under-recording by law enforcement. We've just finished a pilot study just in the province of Ontario, looking at the way that hate crime is policed. And so we're starting to shine a little bit of light on that. and this is one of the questions that we've been asking explicitly, is what's happening to these sorts of cases? Where are they going? There is such a large number that are being lost. And it's also something that this life cycle of a hate crime piece project is intended to get at as well. And I think there are a number of factors that are coming into play there. I mean, if you look up to think back to the distribution of crimes. I mean, so many of them were graffiti, vandalism, those sorts of things that are done under cover of darkness. You know, folks are very conscious of who's around and you know, ensuring that they're not being observed. So in terms of the prosecution, in terms of laying charges, it's often well nigh impossible to identify a perpetrator. So that accounts for, you know, some small portion. But from a community perspective, one of the things that we hear from them is that they're often sort of talked out of the hate crime reporting, or they're discouraged from emphasizing or focusing on the bias or the hate motivation. So there is, you know, in terms of public concern, there is a real reaction against this under enforcement by targeted communities, in particular National Council of Canadian Muslims and a couple of the national Jewish organizations in Canada have really been putting pressure on the federal government to enhance training around for law enforcement around this area, because one of the problems is just the denial that this is an issue worthy of law enforcement attention. So it goes hand in hand with the resistance to community policing. This is seen as soft policing and not really their job, that it's purely political. So there is a rejection on the part of some officers. There are problems of systemic racism, obviously, in policing. So bias comes into play there, but so too do much more pragmatic issues around the ability, the capacity of law enforcement to recognize to identify, recognize, and investigate hate crime as well. There's very little training in this space. Most large services, police services, have a hate crime unit of some sort. Sometimes that's only 1 or 2 officers, but in outside of large urban centers, there typically aren't, hate crime units. There's not training available. Ontario Police College has a week-long unit that they offer twice a year, trying to get it up to 3 years, but it's a small cohort of 25 to 30 people, and mostly Ontario, although they do draw from other provinces as well. So there are very few opportunities for officers to be brought up to speed on this. The hate crime units, it often falls to them to do internal training, but they, as I said, it's 1 or 2 people very often. They don't have the resources, they don't have the capacity necessarily to provide that ongoing training. So that is an important piece. There's also a disincentive in that when you have the hate propaganda offenses, the incitement to hatred, the incitement to genocide, those sorts of cases, they have to be taken to the provincial attorney general's office for approval, for permission to lay those charges. It's one of 2 or 3 categories of crime where that is required. And the onus, the bar is so high in developing those cases that there's a disincentive among police to do the investigation, and among crowns to pursue those charges, because the success rate is under 50% in terms of getting permission from the Attorney General's office. So there are a number of structural problems around policing and charging on hate crime.
Well, thank you so much. Did that
answer all the questions? Yeah.
Yep. This is. I think this is it. We have been depriving you of your right to sleep.
I am going back to bed.
I think we better let you go and have a good nap now. And we thank you so much again for your excellent contribution and great discussion. So thank you so much.
I thank you for the opportunity to join you from afar. Hopefully next time I'll be there. Take care. Thank you.